want to talk about Westernization, and I want to especially call out some of the things that we think are African but actually Western. It's Westernization. And by saying this, I'm actually acknowledging that Westernization has infiltrated almost everywhere. Everywhere on this globe, we are Westernized. Even if you go to places like Asia, you go to Japan, you go to the Amazons, wherever, the Westernization has really infiltrated everywhere. And I like to say you don't have to live in the West to be a Westerner. And I think it's important for us to acknowledge the fact that we have been Westernized. I think we have to actually acknowledge that and make a concrete difference between the fact that this is what we were, or this is what our forefathers were, and this is what we now are. And the reason why I think it's important for us to actually acknowledge that we are Westernized, and that some of the things that we see as normal, we have to call them out and say, actually, this is not how we always used to be. Why I think that is important is just so that we can keep a grasp on where we are coming from. I say that because I have seen how forgetful humans we are. Here in Europe, for instance, there's a time I started to confront the colonial past and my colonial history here in Vienna. And whenever I would, Vienna, Austria, and whenever I would be talking about these colonial situations and talking in regards to Kenya, because we all are quite aware that Kenya came out of colonization, the open colonization, in 1963. That's not even more than, it's about 60 something years, 61, 60, some 60 plus years. And so we are so much aware of the fact that we got colonized, and there's still a good number of us that are alive today that actually lived in a world before the colonizer in Kenya. But as much as I was confronting that past and that part of me that got conditioned, and especially when I was trying to examine my experience, my own reaction to things, and question if that is something that's coming from a colonial conditioning, I found that people here were looking at me as if I am going through something very strange. It's like I'm asking very strange questions. And it's like that is something that you dealt with. Oh my gosh, you got colonized and you need to what not. But then I started to ask people, exactly what was Europe before it got colonized? And a lot of people would get shocked because they couldn't even bring themselves to think in terms of, oh, actually 1,500 years ago, Europe got colonized by the Romans, right? And the fact that a Western civilization was imposed on people here, there was a lot of resistance. The Germania, when you read about the history of the Germania and all the indigenous societies that were established here in Europe back in the days, you will see that they really put up a fight, fighting the Romans. But with time, they succumbed, especially through accepting to get baptized, to become Christians. So Europe was not always Christian. It got Westernized. And so there are so many people here that identify as Westerners, and they think that is who they are, and they have completely forgotten. Actually, sometimes when you're talking about situations that happened here 50 years ago, not even a long time ago. So many people here have no clue of that because we are forgetful as a race. We are, as a human race, as a people, humanity, we are very forgetful. We forget so quickly. And so it's so important for us to continually remind ourselves that all these things that we are becoming, we are not really that. And that's so important because that's how we forget who we are. I tell you, for instance, when I listen to people talking about, for instance, feminism, in Kenya, when you are in the westernized spaces, you will definitely experience the Western patriarchy. You will definitely experience it. And so as a female working in the workplace, as a female in the academic space, in schools, in the educational spaces, you will definitely be touched by the Western patriarchy, the oppressive Western patriarchy. And so a lot of people talk about feminism as if it is a female equality agenda, when in fact it's a Western female equality agenda. By that I mean that there was so much oppression of women here in the West. In Europe, they burned women alive for being women, for being gifted as women. They would be burned alive. And so many horrible things were done to women. And up to date, I believe and I see it, that a lot of women are traumatized by the patriarchy and by the things that happened way before they were even born. It's been passed down. The trauma has been passed down the generations. When you oppress a woman, when you traumatize a woman, you've literally have traumatized a whole generation because the offspring are coming through her, right? And so there's a lot of people here in Europe that are traumatized, but they don't see it as trauma coming from the patriarchal system, the oppressive patriarchal system that is the West. And so from such oppression, the Western women, the European women, rose in defiance of that. And so that was the birth of feminism. Feminism is originating with European women. It's something that is originating with European women. And you have to understand that not all women were oppressed by the men in their society. But here in Europe, it was so bad that the women rose in defiance. And they came up with feminism, asking for equal rights for women. The women were never allowed to vote here. Up to even 50 years ago, there is literally a woman here who's 70, in her 70s right now, that told me literally she had to get permission from her husband to work. That's just 50 years ago here in Europe. And even up to date, I've spoken to women younger than me. And they have explained how the system here is so oppressive to women. It's so mind-blowing to someone, an African like me, when we hear about female equality. We literally look at the West as if it is the standard. But literally, feminism, for one, it is a Westernized women literally rising against the Western patriarchal system. There was no feminism coming up from other parts of the world. Why? Because the women were not oppressed. In Africa, for one, I'm surprised when I listen to Africans when we are talking about feminism, and we talk about feminism as though we have always lived in Europe. We have completely forgotten the fact that as Africans, in our society, women were highly regarded. Amongst the Bantus, women were literally the heads of the family. They were the matriarchs. So even I heard in another podcast, these two women, I love them. The women were saying that, oh, at some point women were not allowed to vote. And I'm like, yeah, but that was not in Kenya. There is no time in history, in Kenyan history, where the women were not allowed to vote. That is American history and European history. So the reason why I am bringing this to the forefront is to catch such misunderstanding. When you are Westernized like we all are, and you completely forget that you one time were not Westernized. So when you're dealing and fighting the Western patriarchal system, because it's the Western system is very patriarchal. That's the pillar of the Western system. When you're fighting that, you forget and begin to deal with imposed trauma. The trauma of the trauma that European women have gone through, we are simply inheriting it, forgetting that we come from a people that actually had massive respect for the female. In certain African communities, the woman was literally a god, right? And so it's so important for us to be able to catch it and say, actually, yes, we are literally Westernized right now. But that's not what we always were. It's important that Europeans, Germans, Austrians, British, it's important that we remember that we were not always a Western society. Europe was not always a Western society. It got colonized, and these Western values were imposed on Europe. And when we even talk about the Western values, are they really Western values? Right? So what is Westernization? What is Westernization exactly? We know that the Western civilization is what we can trace it back to the Greco-Roman Empire. And I mean, we can go back, we can really go all the way back to the times of Anunnaki. We can go back to the Sumerians and the Babylonian kingdom, Babylonian empires. We can go back to that. But for this, let's go trace ourselves back up to the Roman Empire. The agenda of Westernization is literally find people living indigenous ways, in their indigenous ways, find people living autonomous and in ways that they have deduced in a society which people have created for themselves. And then stamp that out. That's Westernization. We call it colonization. When it's another name for Westernization. Westernization is when an empire, let's call it an empire, finds people living in their own organized, internally organized ways, stamp it out and tell them, now, this is how you're going to organize yourself. This is what you must do. You must stop doing this and do this. That's Westernization to me. And so that's why I would say that by that mere definition, you don't have to be a Westerner. You don't have to be living in the West to be a Westerner. I'll tell you something that my grandmother told us. When we were growing up, we went a lot to my grandmother's place. I was born in a city, in a small city. My parents would be the first generation of the Africans that went to school. During colonization, my parents would have gone to school around the time when Kenya just got independent. And so there would have, in my family, both my maternal and paternal family, both my parents would have been the first generation to actually go into the colonial schooling, the Western schooling. And so my grandparents did not go to this Western schooling, but their children did. We know that how this happened is that the missionaries came, and they were the ones that were actually paving the way. And so what they would do, they would say, you have to become a Christian first. If you're going to attend the schools where you're going to be taught things that will help you actually succeed in that new society that has been stamped in. Remember, Westernization is where you can't find people living autonomously, having organized themselves in their own systems, in their own indigenous systems, and then stamp that out and introduce a foreign system. So when you introduce the foreign system, or when the foreign system was introduced, for instance, in Kenya, then you have to take these people through schooling because you need them to learn the new way. And when you take them to schooling, you're schooling them so that they can go and work in the industries that support the system. So what my generation of parents understood it as is that we have been invaded, we have been forced out of our own farms, and we have been put in small villages, cramped up villages. I call them concentration camps. They were put in small villages, so in that way, their livelihood was taken away from them, and they were made completely dependent on the colonial system. And once they are made completely dependent, anyone who is rejecting the ways of turning into a Christian then would eventually be very unsuccessful, because if you don't become a Christian, you're going to not be accepted to join the schools. If you don't join the schools, the new economic system, the new system that has been set up, you will not be able to succeed. And so it looked like at that time that the people that are converting to Christianity, that their lives are improving. And actually, I do know that some of my uncles say that, if we were never converted into Christians, we would really be out there stealing and doing all sorts of bad things, which is really true. But that doesn't mean that Christianity is what really helped. It means that the system that the societies had developed them for themselves, the economic systems, the schooling systems that the society had created for themselves, have been completely removed. And now you either, if you don't fit into this new arrangement, then you become a failure. Not because you really are a failure. You become a failure because you're not fitting into the system. And so you find that in such is how Westernization happens. So you find that at some point our grandparents actually fought fiercely against this Westernization, the schooling system. One of our esteemed females in Kenya, that is Mekatilili Wamenza, she literally rallied the community against it's like she did the first workers' strike was done, led by Mekatilili Wamenza, a Giriama woman in Kenya, where she said she thinks that this type of working system that they have been put in is literally taking them so much away from their culture. They are not able to practice their culture anymore because they are working from 6 to 6 in farms, and most of the time they would not be paid. Actually, they wouldn't be paid. They'll just be given a portion of flour, maize flour. They call it posho, coming from the word portion. So you find that now we are in a situation where we have completely forgotten that. And now we are purely chasing the very thing that destroyed us. We are working so hard to become the very thing that destroyed what we really were before. A lot of people in Kenya, I think, I imagine this is also a reality in other parts of Africa, but in Kenya, where I am speaking to, literally speaking to people, there are people that feel like Westernization brought progress. And I was having a conversation with my friend where she said, she shared this particular video, I'm going to share it, this particular photo. And immediately I engaged her in a conversation, asking her, really consider what you really are saying. You're saying that the future, the positive potential is literally turning into a Westerner. From an indigenous African kid, the potential and the progress is turning into a Westerner. And we've had a long conversation around that. And literally, she feels like, this foreign invasion brought us improvements. We would still be walking long distances and communicating using fire. And that's a feeling that a lot of people have, and that's because a lot of people don't really know exactly what used to happen before the colonizer arrived. We have been fooled into thinking that there was nothing going on. But in reality, we were highly organized. These were communities that were highly organized into amazing judicial systems, economic systems that were working and thriving, schooling system. I can't even begin to tell you the various schooling systems that existed in Kenya alone, in the land they call Kenya alone. Every community had its own education system. There were similarities, but every community ran its own system independently, autonomously. That was destroyed, and in its place we've been given a centralized government. That's what I call a colonizer. A centralized government where you have the topmost, there is someone at the top of the pyramid and the whole thing goes, and that's what I call a colonial structure, as opposed to every household being completely independent and the power coming from the grassroots. So my intention for this video is to remind us and tell us that even though we are in a situation where we have been completely westernized, we have to know and acknowledge and say this is westernization. This is not African. Feminism is not African. Homosexuality, a lot of people say homosexuality, this is a very Western thing. Homosexuality was practiced in Africa. It just was not practiced the way the West wants it practiced. And so what Africans are saying is that we do not want the West coming to impose its values on us. That's westernization. So allow Africans to deal with homosexuality, with their social, because allow Africans to deal with their societies. But that's not the nature of a colonizer. That's not the nature of a colonizer. The idea of a colonizer is they come to you and they find you practicing homosexuality or practicing very different, diverse, a lot of the sexuality. Sexuality was actually a form of ibadah. It was a form of worship. I don't know what to call it worship what, because there wasn't these religions. It was a form of a spiritual, it was both spiritual and physical sexuality. So the colonizers, the Westerners, found Africans doing different things that were keep making them very powerful. And what do? They decide, no. We come with laws and legislation to criminalize homosexuality. Literally, the colonizers, the British, criminalized sexuality, homosexuality in Kenya. And they told people, this is how you have to have sex. This is how you have to kiss each other. And you cannot do this and do this. And now still, the West is coming to tell people, now, if you're going to practice homosexuality, you need to practice it the Western type of way. And that is what people are saying no to. They are not, a lot of African societies are not saying that they are they don't want homosexuality. They're just saying they do not want the West coming to tell them what to do. A lot of us will say, oh, you know, in African settings, we don't like to talk about sex. We don't like to talk about these things. But does that mean that we really did not educate our young ones about sexuality? The population we have today is so unknowledgeable and uninformed about their own sexuality. But previously, go to Uganda, go to Rwanda. Actually, in Rwanda, you will find the most liberal women, powerful women in their sexuality. But right now, the young people in Rwanda have been so indoctrinated in the Western, in Westernization, and actually that's done very perfectly well through Christianity. They have been so indoctrinated that literally Rwandese young women are saying that, oh, you know, we don't talk about sex. This is so African. No, it's not African. It's really not African. Young women were initiated into their sexuality by older women. And young boys were initiated into sexuality by older women. The women really were the ones that were in control and in charge of the whole of the sexuality in the society, in many societies in Africa. So when we go ahead and say, oh, you know, this in Africa, we don't do this and this, first of all, it's good that we identify and say in post-colonial Africa, in the westernized Africa, because I think we are, it's important that we remember how it used to be. It's important that we know that this continent of Africa was thriving with economic activities going. There were kingdoms, there were chiefdoms, there was democracy. It sounds like democracy is a Western value, but literally, the West has not been democratic at all. It has not been democratic. It just is learning democracy now. But when you look at African traditional societies, it was very democratic. So what my intention with this video is to tell fellow humans, because this I'm also addressing Europeans, because we are not the only ones that were westernized. The Europeans are westerners because they were westernized, is to tell us that we have to call westernization what it really is. It is a system that comes to stamp out who we really are and to put us in a great forgetting who we really are and where we're really coming from, whose we're really coming from. I've remembered the story about my grandma. My grandma, we went to visit my grandma a lot, and she always called us Wasomba. Asomba is people that, it's generally Waswahili in Kamba language. And so my grandma always called me and my siblings Wasomba because my parents would have been the ones that moved to town. I started this story and then somehow it got caught up with other things. But what happened is that my parents were the first generation of Africans, or first generation to actually be taken to schools, to the colonial schools. And so as soon as they finished, they would be given jobs, because that's what the idea. The colonial system was trying to create workers. And so they went to become teachers, they went to become secretaries, clerks, all the jobs that were supposed to help the colonial system to run. So when they got these jobs, we were the children that were born to them, that were born to working moms, working fathers, like employed. In terms of, Africans were always working, but we're talking about being employed. And so we were amongst the first generations to live in the cities and in towns. And so whenever we went to visit my grandmother in the rural area, she always called us Wasomba. And Wasomba means Waswahili, because we did not know how to do just simple things like lighting a fire, milking a cow, basic things, because we were born in town. And so that was actually an insult. My grandma was trying to insult us, and I never quite liked it. But when I really think about it, because she always told me, you guys need to come back to the homes because you are living in the wilderness. I was like, the cities are wilderness? Now I know they are. And Wasomba were people, Waswahili are people that left their cultures for Kamba people. A lot of Kamba people converted to become Waswahili because there was a lot of trade. They did a lot of trade. So what happened is that when they go to trade in Mombasa and the coast, they would change they would change to become Muslims. They would change they would convert to become Muslims. And they didn't convert to become Muslims because it was such a wonderful thing. No, it's because they were trying to escape slavery. So when the Kambas go to trade in Mombasa, they would convert and make themselves Muslims so that they are not picked up, because the Arabs would not make a Muslim a slave. It's written in Quran or whatever. So a lot of people went and became Muslims. So these are the people that in turn became the Swahili people. And so the Swahili people were known, it was an insult in my community back in the interior, because these people used to be told that they are Wakosa Kabila. They are people without a culture. They are people without a people. They are coming from nowhere. They have completely decided to leave their own culture for something that is up in the air. Swahili, what is this? Is it Indian? Is it African? Is it Arabic? Is it Portuguese? So it was somewhere there. And so Swahili were literally people that have been Arabized, right? And so for me, I see Waswahili also in the same category as Westerners. Westerners are people whose culture has been removed. All the people here calling themselves Westerners here in Europe, they once were belonging to indigenous European communities and clans that no longer, now they have no idea. They don't know the meanings of their names. The people living here in Europe have no contact with their indigenous ancestors. They don't see them as part of them. A lot of Celtic people are working here, but you tell them this, they're like, but it's the blood is flowing. You can change everything, you can change the culture, but you don't change the blood that's flowing here. The blood that's flowing here, it's the blood that is coming from an ancient ancestor. And so for me, Waswahili and Westerners is one and the same thing. People that have lost their culture. Swahili people, they are no longer Indians, they are not Arabs, they are not Bantu. Who are they? Waswahili, somewhere here in the middle. And I don't say that to drag anybody. Anyone who identifies as a Swahili or you identify as a Westerner, what I'm just trying to say is that, but who are you really? Who are you? Are you able to trace yourself back to who your ancestors were? And don't forget about that. That's the main point of this video. Let's not forget about who we really are. however much we are going up in the air and losing all the roots, let's remain rooted in who we really are, in our indigenous ways, in our indigenous roots. Thank you for your time, and we'll see you in the next video.